Not a negotiation, not a military strike, something quieter than that and far more devastating. A technological breakthrough that no one saw coming, deployed in a theater where Iran believed it had achieved strategic checkmate, and the entire calculus of power in the Strait of Hormuz just inverted in 72 hours. What just happened in the Persian Gulf is not a tactical victory. It is not a temporary advantage. It is the moment the United States demonstrated that the anti-access network Iran spent 2 decades building, the network that was supposed to make American naval dominance obsolete, the network that pushed a $6.5 billion carrier strike group out of effective range, can be rendered irrelevant by a technology that most defense analysts were not even tracking. And if you understand what this technology actually does, not theoretically, not in some future warfare scenario, but right now, operationally, in the most contested waters on planet Earth, then you understand that this week Iran's most sophisticated strategic gamble did not just fail, it backfired in a way that leaves Tehran more exposed than it has been since this conflict began. And some strategic reversals at that level do not simply get walked back. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what technology broke the deadlock, exactly how Iran's response revealed the depth of their miscalculation, and exactly what the Persian Gulf looks like now that the assumptions both sides were operating under have fundamentally changed. Because the headline version of this story is missing the most important parts, and the parts that are missing change everything. If you are new here, this is Daily Brief. We cover the geopolitical shifts that others notice days too late, with the depth and the speed that events of this scale demand. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because when the strategic balance in the world's most important choke point shifts this dramatically, you do not get a second chance to understand what happened before the next crisis begins. Let's go back not weeks, days, because the sequence of events that led to Iran's position collapsing tells you more about the real state of modern naval warfare than any think tank paper you will read this year. Rewind to March 10th. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had, by every measurable assessment, achieved something unprecedented. They had effectively denied the United States control of the Strait of Hormuz without firing a shot that would constitute an act of war. The distributed anti-access network we covered in previous analysis, over 40 fast attack craft in coordinated swarm patterns, autonomous underwater vehicles, smart minefields, coastal anti-ship missile batteries positioned in hardened sites, had forced the USS Theodore Roosevelt carrier strike group to reposition more than 100 nautical miles from the choke point it was deployed to control. For the first time in 40 years, the U.S. Navy could not guarantee freedom of navigation through the strait without accepting risks that Pentagon leadership had deemed unacceptable. Insurance rates for commercial tankers had spiked 47%. Daily oil flow through the strait had decreased by 18%, not because of a blockade, but because shipping companies were rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope rather than risk transiting a war zone where neither side controlled the variables. Iran had won the preliminary phase, not militarily, economically. They had demonstrated that American technological superiority, American naval dominance, American air power, all of it could be neutralized by a sufficiently distributed, sufficiently cheap, sufficiently persistent defensive network. Tehran was not trying to sink the Roosevelt. They were trying to make it irrelevant. And for 6 days, it worked. March 11th, something changed. According to multiple defense sources speaking to Naval News and confirmed through satellite imagery analysis by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the United States deployed to the Gulf of Oman what can only be described as a technological counter that Iran was not prepared for. Not the A-10s we discussed previously, those are still flying patrols, but something operating beneath the surface, something that does not show up on the kind of radar and sensor networks Iran built its entire strategy around. Unmanned underwater vehicles, but not the kind you are thinking of. Not reconnaissance drones, not mine-clearing robots, autonomous hunter-killer systems equipped with AI-driven target recognition, operating in networked swarms of their own, designed for a single purpose, finding and neutralizing the autonomous systems Iran had seeded throughout the strait. The designation, according to sources, is the Orca XLUUV, Extra Large Unmanned Underwater Vehicle, a platform that has been in development for years but whose operational deployment had never been publicly confirmed until satellite images captured support vessels consistent with Orca operations positioned in the Gulf. These are not small systems. Each Orca is 51 feet long, displaces 50 tons, and can operate autonomously for months without human intervention. They do not need to surface. They do not need to communicate continuously. They are programmed with mission parameters, released, and they hunt. March 12th, Iran's distributed network started disappearing. Not all at once, not in a single engagement that could be pointed to as an act of war, but systematically, precisely one node at a time. Autonomous underwater vehicles that had been loitering in known choke points, gone. Smart mines that had been positioned along shipping lanes, neutralized. The subsurface sensor network that allowed Iran to track surface vessel movements, degraded to the point of operational uselessness. And here's the critical detail: Iran had no immediate way of knowing how it was happening. The Orca operates below the acoustic signature threshold that most conventional sonar can reliably detect. It does not emit the kind of electromagnetic signals that traditional counter-drone systems are designed to identify. To Iran's subsurface monitoring network, the Orcas were ghosts, and those ghosts were systematically dismantling 2 decades of strategic investment. Now here is what you need to understand. The technology itself is significant, but the timing of its deployment is what tells the real story. The United States did not lead with the Orca. It allowed Iran to believe for 6 full days that their anti-access strategy had worked. It allowed the Roosevelt to reposition. It allowed insurance rates to spike. It allowed Tehran to experience what strategic success against the U.S. Navy felt like. And then, once Iran had committed to the strategy, once they had positioned their assets in a configuration designed to sustain the denial operation, the United States deployed a counter system that those assets could not detect, could not target, and could not survive. That is not a military tactic. That is a psychological operation. And the message it sends is more devastating than any kinetic strike could have been. The message is this: we let you think you won, and then we showed you that we were operating on a level you did not know existed. If you have not subscribed to Daily Brief, do it now. This is the analysis that connects the technology to the strategy to the geopolitics, and the geopolitics to what happens in your world next. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because the next 48 hours will determine whether this breakthrough becomes a new equilibrium or whether it accelerates the path to something far worse. Now here is where most of the coverage stops. It treats the Orca deployment as a tactical innovation, a new asset in the theater, a data point to be noted. Stop. That reading misses the entire strategic picture. What happened in the Strait of Hormuz in the last 72 hours is not just about one weapon system neutralizing another. It is about the collapse of Iran's entire theory of victory in this conflict, and that collapse is forcing decisions in Tehran that reveal just how badly their gamble has backfired. Let me give you the 3 developments you need to hold in your head simultaneously, because together they form a picture that none of them suggests individually. Development number 1. Iran's subsurface advantage has been erased, and they have no short-term counter. We have covered the Orca's capabilities, but let's be explicit about what Iran has lost operationally. For 2 decades, Iran's military doctrine in the Gulf has been built around asymmetric denial. The logic was elegant. The United States has bigger ships, better aircraft, more advanced missiles, so do not fight that war. Instead, make the water itself unusable through distributed, low-cost systems that are too numerous to eliminate and too cheap to make elimination cost-effective. Swarm tactics with fast attack craft, autonomous mines that can be deployed from commercial vessels, underwater sensor networks that turn the entire strait into a monitored kill zone. The strategy was not to win a naval battle. It was to make naval battles irrelevant by controlling the subsurface and shallow water environment where American advantages matter least. The Orca deployment breaks that logic entirely, because now the United States has its own distributed, autonomous, low-cost, relative to a manned platform, system that operates in the exact environment Iran thought it controlled. And critically, the Orca is not just defensive. It is not sweeping mines and calling it a day. According to unclassified Navy briefings on the platform's capabilities, the Orca is designed to carry offensive payloads, including torpedoes and anti-submarine warfare systems. That means it is not just clearing Iranian systems, it is hunting them, and it can continue hunting them for months without requiring human intervention or vulnerable surface support. Iran's subsurface network is not damaged, it is obsolete. And they have no equivalent counter-system in development, at least not one that Western intelligence agencies are tracking, and certainly not one that can be deployed on the timeline this conflict is operating under. Development number 2, Iran's attempted escalation failed to change the operational picture and revealed critical intelligence gaps. Here is what Iran did after the Orca deployment became operationally apparent, and here is why it made everything worse. On March 14th, Iranian forces launched a coordinated strike package aimed at disrupting the perceived support infrastructure for the U.S. subsurface operations. Missiles targeted the port facilities at Fujairah in the UAE, one of the key logistics hubs for U.S. naval operations in the region. Drones targeted what Iranian intelligence assessed to be Orca control nodes positioned at undisclosed locations in Oman. The strikes were significant, not symbolic harassment, but genuine attempts to degrade American operational capacity. And they failed, not partially, almost completely. According to reporting from Reuters and confirmed by UAE officials, the missile strikes on Fujairah were intercepted by a combination of Patriot and THAAD missile defense systems that the United States had quietly reinforced in the weeks prior. Out of 11 missiles launched, 9 were intercepted, and the 2 that impacted hit warehouse facilities that, according to U.S. Central Command, were not involved in Orca operations. The drone strikes in Oman hit locations that were, in the assessment of multiple defense analysts reviewing satellite imagery, decoys, inflatable structures, electronic signature generators, the kind of deception infrastructure that militaries deploy when they expect targeting and want the adversary to waste resources hitting nothing. Iran committed significant assets to those strikes. They revealed launch positions, expended precision-guided munitions, burned intelligence sources to identify what they believed were high-value targets. And they hit decoys in empty warehouses. That is not just a tactical failure, that is an intelligence failure. It means Iran does not know where the Orca operations are actually being supported from. It means their targeting data is corrupted, outdated, or deliberately fed to them by counterintelligence operations. And it means that when they escalate, they are operating blind in ways that their leadership may not fully understand. Development number 3. Regional actors are repositioning toward the United States faster than anyone predicted, and this is where Iran's backfire becomes a geopolitical cascade. 3 weeks ago, we covered Qatar's withdrawal from mediation, Iraq's accelerated timeline for ending the U.S. coalition presence, the fracturing of the Arab coalition, the widespread sentiment among Gulf states that hosting U.S. military infrastructure made them targets rather than partners. That was the trajectory, regional actors distancing themselves from Washington because the costs were too high and the benefits were unclear. In the last 72 hours, that trajectory reversed. According to diplomatic sources cited by Al Arabiya and corroborated by statements from UAE officials, the Emirates has not only reaffirmed its hosting of U.S. military assets, but has offered expanded basing access for what it is calling defensive counter-drone and counter-missile operations. Translation: the UAE watched Iran launch missiles at their territory, watched U.S. systems intercept those missiles, and concluded that the security relationship with Washington is not a liability. It is the only thing that kept Fujairah from burning. Oman, which had been publicly distancing itself from any role that could be perceived as taking sides, quietly confirmed through diplomatic channels that it is cooperating with U.S. intelligence operations aimed at identifying Iranian launch sites. That is a massive shift. Oman has spent this entire conflict trying to remain neutral, trying to preserve its relationship with Tehran, trying to avoid becoming a target. The fact that they are now sharing intelligence on Iranian military positions tells you that they have concluded that neutrality is no longer possible, and that if they have to choose, they are choosing the side that just demonstrated it can protect them. Even Saudi Arabia, whose support for the conflict has been consistent but whose regional credibility has been limited, is now being described by analysts at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., as exploring a more public coordination role with U.S. operations, something Riyadh had avoided to prevent further alienating other Gulf actors. The regional coalition is not fracturing anymore. It is reconsolidating, and it is reconsolidating around the United States, not because of diplomacy, not because of incentives, because Iran escalated, failed, and in failing demonstrated that their threats are manageable when the United States is willing to deploy the systems that counter them. Receive development number 3. Subscribe to Daily Brief right now if you are following this closely. We do not just report what happened, we show you the pattern behind what happened and what that pattern tells you is coming next. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, share this with anyone who needs to understand why the war just shifted and what that shift actually means. Now let's talk about what is not being discussed in any of the mainstream coverage, the economic reversal, because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a military theater, it is the artery through which the global economy pumps energy. And that artery just reopened in a way that has consequences far beyond the Gulf. March 15th, Lloyd's of London issued a revised risk assessment for tanker traffic through the Strait. Insurance premiums, which had spiked to levels not seen since the tanker war of the 1980s, dropped 22% in a single day. That is not a gradual market correction. That is the insurance industry, the most risk-averse sector of global finance, concluding that the threat environment has fundamentally changed. Shipping companies that had rerouted tankers around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 12 days and 40% to transportation costs, are now reversing those routes. According to data from marine traffic and tanker trackers, Daily oil flow through the strait has returned to 94% of pre-crisis levels as of March 16th. Let me be clear about what that means. The global economy was pricing in a sustained disruption to Gulf energy exports. That disruption was going to force Europe back toward Russian energy dependence, force Asia into bidding wars for limited supply, force inflation rates that had finally started stabilizing to spike again. And in 72 hours, that scenario evaporated. Not because Iran withdrew, because they were neutralized. The markets are not responding to diplomacy. They are responding to the demonstrated fact that the United States can now operate in the strait, despite Iran's best efforts to deny that access. And markets do not care about the politics. They care about the probability, and the probability of sustained disruption just collapsed. What does this mean for you? Let's be direct about the implications, because this is not an abstract geopolitical shift. This is a change that will show up in your cost of living, your investment portfolio, your national security environment. If you are watching energy prices, gasoline, heating oil, diesel, understand that the Brent crude futures market has already begun pricing in the reopened strait. Prices dropped 8% in the 2 trading days following the Orca deployment reports. If you filled your tank last week versus this week, you are already seeing the impact. If you are a business that depends on logistics, shipping costs are going to stabilize faster than any analyst predicted 5 days ago. That affects inventory costs, it affects consumer prices, it affects the inflation outlook that central banks use to set interest rates. If you follow geopolitics and military technology, you just watch the future of naval warfare get written in real time. Unmanned systems are not the future, they are the present, and the nation that can deploy them at scale, with the autonomy to operate without constant human control, with the AI sophistication to distinguish targets in complex environments, that nation controls the subsurface battle space. The United States just demonstrated that it is that nation. China is watching, Russia is watching. Every regional power with maritime ambitions is recalculating what kind of navy it actually needs to build, because the answer just changed. If you live anywhere in the Western world, the risk of this conflict spiraling into a broader regional war that disrupts global energy supplies, crashes markets, and forces military mobilization, that risk just decreased significantly. Not to zero, never to zero, but the scenario where Iran successfully closes the strait and the global economy goes into crisis, that scenario is off the table as long as the Orca network remains operational. I see 2 paths from here, no middle ground, 2 roads. The first path, Iran absorbs the strategic reversal, recalibrates and shifts to a posture that accepts they cannot deny the United States access to the Gulf. Tehran pulls back its remaining distributed assets, not publicly, not in a way that looks like surrender, but quietly, operationally. The subsurface game is over, they lost, and they refocus on the diplomatic and political dimensions where they still have leverage. This path requires rationality, institutional flexibility, and a willingness to accept that the gamble failed without doubling down. Historically, that is not how Iran responds to strategic setbacks, but historically, Iran has never faced a technological counter this comprehensive this quickly. The second path, Iran escalates asymmetrically in theaters where the Orca is irrelevant. Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, the places where Iranian proxy forces operate and where American technological dominance does not translate into control. If Tehran concludes that they cannot win in the Gulf, they can still impose costs elsewhere, and those costs can be high enough to force a broader negotiation that gives them back some of what they lost. This path is more likely because it does not require admitting defeat, it requires changing the battlefield. And Iran has spent 40 years building the infrastructure to fight on multiple battlefields simultaneously. I think we are on the second path. I think that because of what Iran has already done in the 48 hours since their escalation failed, attacks on U.S. positions in Syria have increased 40% according to Central Command reporting. Houthi strikes on Saudi infrastructure, which had decreased during the Gulf crisis, have resumed. Hezbollah in Lebanon has moved forces closer to the Israeli border in what analysts are describing as a readiness posture. Iran is not retreating, they are redirecting, and that means the conflict is not de-escalating, it is metastasizing. Here's what the history books will record about this moment, regardless of how it ends. The Islamic Republic of Iran, a nation that had built its entire post-revolution military doctrine around denying superior adversaries the ability to project power, deployed what it believed was an unbeatable defensive network in the world's most strategic choke point. For 6 days it worked. The United States Navy, the most powerful maritime force in human history, could not guarantee safe passage through 21 miles of water. And then the United States deployed a technology that Iran had not accounted for, that their sensors could not track, that their systems could not counter, and in 72 hours, the entire strategic picture inverted. Iran's escalation revealed not strength, but desperation. Their missile strikes hit decoys. Their intelligence was corrupted, their regional position, which had been strengthening as Arab states distanced from Washington, reversed as those same states watched American defensive systems protect them from Iranian attack. The gamble was elegant: deny the Americans the Gulf without firing the shot that starts the war. Control the subsurface, control the narrative, control the economic pressure until Washington accepts a negotiated settlement on terms favorable to Tehran. But the gamble assumed the United States would fight the war Iran was prepared for. It assumed American systems were visible, detectable, targetable. It assumed the technological gap had narrowed enough that quantity could overcome quality. All of those assumptions were wrong. And in war, when your foundational assumptions are wrong, you do not just lose the battle, you lose the ability to understand why you lost, and that makes the next decision even more dangerous than the last. We are going to keep tracking every angle of this story: the Orca operations, the Iranian response, the regional realignments, the economic implications, and the signals that tell us whether this breakthrough leads to stability or something far worse. If this video gave you something you did not have before, subscribe right now. Share it. Leave a comment telling me whether you think Iran escalates in other theaters or pulls back to reassess. I read every one of them. And here's the question I want to leave you with. If a nation spends 2 decades building a strategy, commits its most sophisticated assets to executing that strategy, watches that strategy succeed for 6 days, and then watches it collapse in 72 hours against a technology they did not know was deployable, what does that nation do next? And when the answer to that question determines whether 21 million barrels of oil per day continues flowing to the global economy, who is responsible for making sure the answer is not escalation?